At first glance, it appears to be little more than a historical relic, a moment preserved in 1890 Alabama. But concealed within this portrait is a secret so profound, so intentionally hidden, that it went unnoticed for 128 years. What truth could a single image hold for over a century? What detail could overturn everything we thought we understood about freedom, endurance, and the pledges made after the Civil War? This is not merely a story about a photograph. It is a story about what unfolds when we truly take a closer look. If you want to discover stories that history attempted to erase, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. You won't believe what we are about to uncover. Docker. Marcus Webb had studied thousands of images throughout his career as a historian of the Reconstruction era. Yet on an August afternoon in 2018, while sorting through donations at the Montgomery Historical Society in Alabama, one studio portrait brought him to a halt. The image showed a black family of 5 posed before a painted backdrop. Professional lighting, deliberate composition, costly details. The father stood with dignity beside an ornate chair. The mother sat gracefully, hands folded. 3 children surrounded them. A boy of 12, a girl of 9, a younger boy of 6. All wore fine clothing suggesting prosperity. On the reverse it read, "The Harris Family, Montgomery, Alabama, June 1890." 25 years after emancipation, this family seemed to have achieved success. But something disturbed Marcus. The parents' eyes held fatigue beneath their formal poise. The children's smiles appeared forced. The mother's hands were arranged with excessive precision. Marcus retrieved his magnifying glass and studied the image closely. He examined faces, garments, the background. Then he focused on the mother's hands. His breath caught. On her left wrist, barely visible beneath lace trim, was a faint scar, a thin mark curving around her wrist, the hallmark of iron shackles. Marcus leaned nearer, heart racing. The scar was undeniable. But this was 1890, a quarter century after slavery ended. Such marks should have faded unless they were more recent. He inspected her right wrist. Another scar, more concealed. Both wrists bore evidence of restraint. He shifted to the father's hand resting on the chair. The same faint marking. Marcus sat back, pulse pounding. This was not just a portrait of a successful family. These individuals were concealing something. If his hunch was correct, they were fugitives from slavery posing as free citizens, carrying proof of captivity on their skin. They had entered the studio, given a false name, and recorded their new life. It was either an act of extraordinary bravery or a desperate affirmation, proving to themselves that they had indeed reached freedom. Marcus immediately investigated the Harris family. He searched census records, city directories, property registrations, church memberships, anything confirming their presence in Montgomery in 1890. Days passed. Every search yielded nothing. No Harris family matching that description appeared anywhere. No property, no business licenses, no voter registration, nothing. The absence itself was telling. Prosperous free black families showed up in civic records. Complete invisibility suggested deliberate concealment. Marcus expanded his search across Alabama, finding several Harris families, but none aligned with the photograph's ages or composition. Then Marcus shifted his strategy. What if Harris was not their true name? Escaped slaves commonly adopted new identities, new name, new city, new life, hoping no one would ask questions. He contacted colleague Dr. Evelyn Torres, a specialist in photographic analysis and African-American migration. Evelyn examined high-resolution scans in her laboratory. "The scarring is real," she confirmed. Both parents display marks consistent with prolonged shackling. But observe the positioning. She pointed at the screen. The mother's wrists are angled to minimize the visibility of the scars. The father's stance does the same. Those lace cuffs are not decorative. They're concealing evidence. They knew the scars showed. Marcus said quietly. They tried hiding them. Evelyn zoomed in on the mother's wrist. But not entirely. Any professional photographer would have noticed the scar and adjusted the pose to hide it completely. Unless the family insisted on this exact arrangement. Why not conceal them fully? Marcus pondered. Evelyn considered carefully. Maybe they wanted casual viewers to overlook them, but intended for someone, someday, looking closely to perceive the truth. Perhaps this photograph was insurance. Proof of what they escaped, hidden in plain sight. Marcus felt a chill. We need to discover who they really were, where they fled from. He spent the following week in archives, combing plantation records and newspapers. If they had escaped, there would be documentation. Even after 1865, owners pursued those who left, calling them absconded contracted workers. Finally, Marcus found it. The Montgomery Advertiser, April 1889. Reward for Joseph and Ruth, contracted workers who abandoned obligations at Riverside Plantation, Georgia, March 1889. 3 children missing. Contact Thornton Estate. Joseph and Ruth, not Harris, escaped from Georgia 14 months before this photograph. The description continued: Joseph, age 35, carpenter. Ruth, age 30, seamstress. Dangerous fugitives. Dangerous for wanting freedom. Marcus contacted the Georgia State Archives, requesting Riverside Plantation records. Within days, digitized documents revealed a brutal apparatus. Riverside operated on debt-peonage, contracts binding formerly enslaved people in perpetual servitude, differing from slavery only in name. Records showed Joseph contracted in 1875, 10 years after emancipation. His contract claimed debts for food and shelter during the transition to freedom. Ruth was contracted in 1876. They married in 1877. Documented as if the owner's permission mattered. Each child's birth increased their debt. Ledgers showed charges for midwives, extra rations, first child 1878, second 1881, third 1884. Each birth added 50 diritu to 75, impossible amounts when labor was credited at pennies daily. The arithmetic was designed to be inescapable. Marcus traced their account balances year by year. Despite constant labor, debt grew. By 1889, Joseph and Ruth owed over $800. They would need decades more work, and new charges ensured they never succeeded. The contracts were legal masterpieces. Dense language appearing legitimate while creating permanent bondage. Joseph and Ruth agreed to work until debts were fully satisfied, with the owner having sole authority over amounts and satisfaction. No appeals, no oversight, no escape. Worse were provisions allowing transfer of obligations, meaning they could be sold. Though paperwork called it contract assignment, Marcus found evidence of 3 transfers between 1875 and 1885 before Riverside. Plantation records showed Joseph and Ruth present for work on March 12, 1889. By March 13, they had vanished with 3 children. An immediate search was organized, law enforcement notified, rewards posted across Georgia and Alabama. But they had planned carefully. March was planting season. Plantations focused on crops, guards watched fields, not quarters. Joseph's carpentry skills meant knowing how to move silently, avoid roads, cover tracks. Montgomery was 100 miles from Riverside, reachable on foot in 2 weeks, traveling nights, hiding days. Far enough that owners might not search immediately. Montgomery had a growing black community where newcomers could blend, find work, disappear. With Joseph's carpentry and Ruth's sewing skills, they possessed marketable talents requiring no references. A construction boom meant work without questions, cash payment, no documentation. In black communities, good work mattered more than papers. By July 1889, church records showed Harris, Joseph Carpenter, joining Dexter Avenue Baptist. They had made it. They had disappeared successfully. Marcus pieced together how Joseph and Ruth survived those first desperate months. With marketable skills, they found work quickly. Joseph on construction sites where bosses cared about ability, not background. Ruth taking sewing at home while watching children. No references needed, just good work and word of mouth. Church records from Dexter Avenue Baptist, July 1889. Harris, Joseph, carpenter. Wife Ruth, seamstress. 3 children. No prior address, no previous affiliation documented. They chose Harris carefully. Common enough not to attract attention, not so common that anyone would question it. Arrived late March or April 1889, found work immediately, felt secure enough by July to join church. A significant step showing they believed they had successfully disappeared. But fear remained constant. Every knock at the door could be slave catchers operating as contracted worker recovery agents. Every white stranger could represent the Thornton estate. Every newspaper might carry descriptions, real names, rewards. The June 1890 studio photograph took on new meaning. 14 months after escape, they had saved enough for a professional portrait. Fine clothing, formal setting, careful composition. An extraordinary achievement. But more than achievement, it was defiance. Walking into that studio as the Harris family, they declared freedom. Created proof they existed with a new identity, a new life. The photograph was documentation, evidence, a claim to legitimacy. Marcus understood now why they positioned themselves so carefully, why scars remained partially visible. Hiding from the world, but not from history. Perhaps hoping that someday someone would look closely enough to see the truth, to understand what they had escaped, what courage it took to build this life. Evelyn discovered more. Montgomery City Directories, 1891, listed Joseph Harris operating a small carpentry shop on Commerce Street. By 1893, Harris Carpentry, custom furniture and home repairs. Not just surviving, but thriving. Building a legitimate business under chosen names. But fear never disappeared. No property records in their name. They rented, avoiding permanent documentation. No voter registration, despite black men having that right in 1890s Alabama. No business licenses requiring extensive paperwork. They remained while building a life. The studio portrait represented the peak of their success and their greatest vulnerability. Formal documentation of the Harris family meant a permanent record that could someday be discovered. But they took that risk, needing proof for themselves, for their children, that they were truly free. Marcus found school enrollment records. September 1889, 3 Harris children enrolled at Centenary Methodist Church School. Oldest boy, James Harris, 11, girl, Elizabeth Harris, 8, youngest. William Harris, 5. Given false names like their parents, but real education, real opportunity. Consistent attendance through the early 1890s. These children learning to read and write, skills their parents likely never fully acquired. This was why Joseph and Ruth risked everything. Marcus's research took a devastating turn when Evelyn found a death notice. The Montgomery Examiner, February 1897. Harris, Ruth, age 38, suddenly. Survived by husband Joseph and 3 children. Services at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Marcus read it repeatedly, heart sinking. Ruth died just 8 years after escaping to freedom, at only 38. Suddenly. Suggested accident or acute illness, not prolonged sickness. The studio portrait from 1890 had captured Ruth in one of her few moments of peace. 7 years later, she was gone, leaving Joseph to raise 3 children alone under a false identity, still fearful of discovery. Harris Carpentry disappeared from city directories after 1897. Church records showed Joseph through 1898, then nothing. Children's school enrollment ended 1897. The family had left Montgomery entirely, perhaps unable to sustain themselves after Ruth's death, perhaps finally discovered by Thornton agents. Evelyn suggested searching other cities where Alabama black families commonly migrated: Atlanta, Birmingham, Nashville, northern cities like Chicago and Detroit. Weeks passed with nothing. Then, genealogist Dr. Patricia Holmes emailed Marcus. "I may have information about your family," she wrote. "I've been researching black migration to Philadelphia in the 1890s. Found records that might match." Patricia had discovered Mother Bethel AME, church records listing Joseph Harris, carpenter, joining August 1898 with 3 children. James, Elizabeth, William. Ages don't quite match your Montgomery records. These children are listed slightly older. Could be intentional misrepresentation. What caught my attention was the notation. Family relocated from Alabama following death of wife and mother. Marcus's pulse quickened. Joseph had fled Montgomery after Ruth's death, taking his children north to Philadelphia, where they could truly disappear. Philadelphia in the 1890s had a substantial black community with established churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. A skilled carpenter could find steady work. Children could attend better schools than Southern options. Most importantly, Philadelphia was far enough from Georgia that the Thornton estate's reach would be limited. Marcus found additional records showing Joseph Harris operating a small carpentry business in Philadelphia's 7th Ward, 1899 to 1911. The business appeared moderately successful, employing several workers by the mid-1900s. Property records showed Joseph purchased a small house in 1905. The first time owning property in his own name, even if that name remained false. After decades of bondage, contracts, and fear, Joseph Freeman finally owned something. The children's records were harder to trace. James attended Philadelphia public schools through 1895, then disappeared. Likely began working after his mother's death. Elizabeth appeared through 1898, William through 1902. What happened after? Did they know their real family name? Did Joseph tell them about Riverside, the escape, the life they had fled? Marcus found possible answers in an unexpected place. A death certificate from Philadelphia, 1918. Joseph Harris, age 64, carpenter, died of influenza during the epidemic, survived by sons James and William. No Elizabeth mentioned, suggesting she had married, changed surnames, moved away, or died. The certificate listed Joseph's birthplace as Virginia. A lie, since plantation records clearly showed him at Riverside since 1875, likely born in Georgia or sold there young. Even in death, Joseph maintained a false identity to protect his children. His real name, his real history, his courageous escape, all buried with him under the Harris name. Marcus felt profound sadness for a man who had lived his entire adult life hiding, never able to claim his true identity, never recognized for extraordinary courage. Joseph Freeman had escaped slavery twice, first in 1865 when emancipation supposedly freed him, then again in 1889 when he took real freedom for himself and his family. Patricia Holmes made a crucial breakthrough. Searching Riverside records more carefully, she found a document Marcus had initially overlooked. A marriage record from 1877, Joseph Freeman, age 23, to Ruth Williams, age 21. Both contracted workers of Riverside Plantation, Burke County, Georgia. Marriage approved by estate management. Freeman and Williams, their real surnames recorded in the plantation's meticulous documentation. Joseph Freeman and Ruth Williams, who became Joseph and Ruth Harris, who risked everything to save their children from bondage. Marcus traced Ruth Williams through plantation records, finding her listed as arriving at Riverside in 1876, transferred from another property. Before that, the trail disappeared into Reconstruction chaos. Joseph Freeman's history went slightly further. Purchased by Riverside's owner in 1875 from a Virginia plantation, brought south for his carpentry skills. Marcus finally knew who they truly were, not just fugitives, not just the Harris family, but Joseph Freeman and Ruth Williams Freeman, real people with real names who had been stolen, sold, contracted, and finally freed themselves. In March 2019, Marcus published his findings in the Journal of American History. The Freeman family portrait, fugitive freedom and hidden evidence in a Reconstruction-era photograph. The article included high-resolution images showing the scars clearly alongside plantation records, reward notices, and a trail of evidence showing the escape and rebuilt lives. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Historians recognized the significance. Photographic evidence of escaped debt-peonage workers, documentation of a system that kept black people enslaved decades after the Civil War ended. News outlets nationwide picked up the story. The studio portrait appeared on front pages, television, and social media. Ruth's partially hidden scars, invisible for 129 years, now testified to millions about the reality of post-Civil War freedom. Educational programs incorporated the Freeman family story into curricula about Reconstruction, debt-peonage, and the long struggle for actual freedom extending far beyond 1865. The Montgomery Historical Society organized an exhibition, Hidden Freedom: The Freeman Family and the Price of Escape. Thousands came to view evidence of courage preserved in a simple family photograph. Marcus wanted more than academic recognition. He wanted descendants of Joseph and Ruth Freeman. Did any of their children's children survive? Did anyone carry forward the Freeman name, or had it remained buried under the Harris alias? Patricia helped search Philadelphia records for James, Elizabeth, and William Harris. She found James listed in city directories as a carpenter like his father, operating a small business until his death in 1945. William appeared as a railroad worker, dying in 1951. Elizabeth remained elusive until they found a marriage record from 1899. Elizabeth Harris to Robert Thompson, a Philadelphia school teacher. Through marriage records, death certificates, birth records, and census data, Marcus and Patricia slowly traced descendants forward through the 20th century. Some remained in Philadelphia, others moved to New York, Chicago, and Detroit during the Great Migration. The family had branched and spread, apparently not aware of their true history. Marcus's article caught the attention of Diana Thompson in Chicago. She contacted him through the Historical Society. "Your article mentioned Elizabeth Harris in Philadelphia in the 1890s. Diana wrote, "Could this be my great-great-grandmother? We have family stories about Philadelphia, but nothing before that." Marcus and Diana spent weeks comparing records, tracing genealogies, and confirming connections. Eventually, the evidence became undeniable. Diana Thompson was the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Freeman, daughter of Joseph and Ruth Freeman, who had escaped Riverside Plantation in 1889. Diana had grown up knowing her family came from Philadelphia, but nothing about deeper history, nothing about Georgia or Alabama or the desperate escape. Marcus sent Diana copies of everything: the studio portrait, plantation records, reward notices, documentation of her ancestors' courage. Diana called after receiving the materials, her voice shaking. "I'm looking at my great-great-grandparents right now, Joseph and Ruth. I never knew their real names. We always thought Harris was our original family name. I never knew they were fugitives. I never knew about the scars." She paused. "My great-grandmother Elizabeth died when I was young, but I remember she used to say something strange. Remember, we paid for our freedom twice. I never understood. Now I do. They were born into slavery, supposedly freed in 1865, then had to escape again in 1889, because freedom was a lie." Marcus helped Diana connect with other descendants. They found relatives nationwide. Dozens descended from Joseph and Ruth Freeman, none aware of the full story. In November 2019, 23 descendants gathered in Montgomery for a family reunion and memorial service. They stood together at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where Joseph and Ruth had first felt safe enough to join a community under assumed names. Diana spoke, holding a large print of the studio portrait. Our ancestors, Joseph Freeman and Ruth Williams, risked everything for us. They escaped from a system designed to keep them enslaved forever. They lived in constant fear of discovery. But they did it so their children could grow up truly free. Deanna continued, addressing the gathered descendants. This photograph is evidence of their courage. Ruth's scars are visible because she wanted someone someday to know the truth, to understand what freedom cost, to remember it wasn't given freely. It had to be taken, fought for, protected every single day. The family commissioned a memorial marker to be placed in Montgomery, near where the photography studio once stood, in memory of Joseph Freeman and Ruth Williams Freeman, who escaped from bondage in 1889 to build a life of freedom for their children. Their courage preserved in a photograph, their legacy lives on in us. Marcus attended the ceremony, watching descendants gather around the marker. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of people declared dangerous fugitives for wanting freedom. All living the life Joseph and Ruth fought to create an existence without fear, without contracts, without someone claiming to own their labor. After the ceremony, Diana approached Marcus. Thank you for seeing what no one else saw for 129 years, for looking closely enough to notice my great-grandmother's scars, for caring enough to find the truth. Marcus shook his head. Ruth wanted someone to see. She made sure the evidence was there. I just happened to be the one who finally looked closely enough. The memorial became a pilgrimage site for descendants and others moved by the story. People came from across the country to see the marker, to understand what Joseph and Ruth had risked. Local schools organized field trips, teachers using the Freeman family story to teach students about Reconstruction's reality. The studio portrait traveled to museums nationwide, first the Montgomery exhibition, then Atlanta, Chicago, Washington, D.C. At each location, historians searched their own archives for similar photographs, finding dozens showing evidence of continued bondage, debt-peonage, and sharecropping exploitation decades after 1865. The Freeman portrait had opened a door, revealing how much history had been hiding in plain sight. The American Historical Association issued a statement acknowledging that the Reconstruction narrative had been incomplete, and that slavery's end was far more complicated and prolonged than previously taught. Textbook publishers began revisions. Churches across the South organized oral history projects, recording testimonies from elders who remembered family stories about the decades after emancipation. The stories poured out, generations of trauma and survival finally being documented. But the most powerful impact was on the Freeman descendants themselves. Diana Thompson became a speaker and educator, traveling to schools and universities to share her ancestors' story. She always brought copies of the studio portrait, pointing out the scars her great-grandmother deliberately left partially visible. Ruth Freeman wanted us to know. Deanna would tell audiences. She couldn't write down the truth. She probably couldn't write at all. She couldn't leave letters or diaries. But she had this photograph, and she made sure it contained evidence. Those scars were her testimony, preserved for 129 years until someone finally saw them and understood. The Freeman family story challenged comfortable narratives about American freedom. It forced a confrontation with the reality that emancipation was a process, not an event. For many black families, true freedom came not from government proclamation, but from dangerous acts of self-liberation. Joseph and Ruth Freeman hadn't waited for freedom to be granted. They seized it, knowing the risks, choosing their children's futures over their own safety. Marcus often thought about that choice, about what it took to walk away from Riverside Plantation in the darkness of March 1889. Joseph and Ruth had 3 children to protect. No money, no resources, every reason to believe they would be caught and punished. But they went anyway, traveling 100 miles on foot, hiding during the day, moving at night, driven by the absolute conviction that anything was better than raising children in bondage. And they succeeded. Their children grew up free, attended schools, learned trades, built lives of their own choosing. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren became teachers, doctors, artists, activists, living the dreams Joseph and Ruth fought to make possible. The photograph remained Marcus's daily reminder of why historical research mattered, why looking closely at the past was essential, why stories needed telling even when they challenged comfortable myths. Every time he looked at that studio portrait, he saw Joseph's protective presence, Ruth's carefully positioned wrists, the children's serious faces. He saw courage and fear and hope and determination, all captured in a single moment. Scholars began publishing related research, building on Marcus's work, studies examining debt-peonage systems across the South, documenting how many black families remained enslaved under different names decades after 1865. Genealogists helped other families discover their own hidden histories of escape and survival. Photographers examined historical images with new awareness, finding similar evidence in unexpected places. The Freeman portrait sparked a broader conversation about how history gets told, who gets remembered, whose stories are preserved versus buried. It raised questions about complicity, how many white Americans knew that systems like Riverside Plantation existed, but said nothing. How many benefited from the legal exploitation of black labor, while claiming slavery had ended? Marcus received letters from people across the country, many sharing their own family stories of grandparents or great-grandparents who had escaped similar situations. Stories that had been whispered in families, but never publicly told, never documented, never acknowledged in official histories. The Freeman portrait had given permission for these stories to emerge, validation that they mattered and deserved recognition. Diana Thompson organized annual gatherings for Freeman descendants, creating a community around shared ancestry. At the second reunion in 2020, 47 family members attended, nearly twice the first year's number. More relatives kept emerging as word spread. DNA tests confirmed connections, and genealogical research connected branches separated for generations. The family Joseph and Ruth had fought to protect and free was coming back together, stronger than ever. 2 years after Marcus Webb first noticed the scars in that studio portrait, he sat in his university office, surrounded by letters from researchers, students, descendants, people moved by the Freeman family story. The photograph had changed how people understood Reconstruction, how they taught the history of freedom in America, how they looked at old photographs with awareness of hidden truths. The studio portrait now hung in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, part of a permanent exhibition on debt-peonage and the struggle for freedom after the Civil War. Visitors stood before it daily, reading the story, seeing Ruth's scars, understanding what Joseph and Ruth had sacrificed to give their children a chance at real freedom. Educational programs nationwide incorporated the Freeman family story into curricula. Students learned to examine primary sources critically, look for hidden details, and question accepted narratives about when slavery truly ended. The photograph became a teaching tool, showing how ordinary objects, a simple family portrait, could contain extraordinary stories waiting to be discovered. Marcus received emails from researchers who had begun examining historical photographs more carefully, finding similar evidence of debt-peonage, sharecropping exploitation, and continued bondage decades after 1865. The Freeman portrait had opened a door, revealing how much history had been hiding in plain sight. But for Marcus, the most meaningful impact was on the Freeman descendants. Deanna Thompson traveled to schools and universities, sharing her ancestors' story, always bringing copies of the studio portrait. Ruth Freeman wanted us to know. Diana would tell audiences. She couldn't write down the truth. She couldn't leave letters. But she had this photograph, and she made sure it contained evidence. Those scars were her testimony, preserved for 129 years until someone finally saw and understood. The Freeman family story challenged comfortable narratives. It forced a confrontation with the reality that emancipation was a process, not an event. For many Black families, true freedom came from dangerous self-liberation, not government proclamation. Joseph and Ruth Freeman hadn't waited for the system to grant freedom. They seized it. Marcus kept the studio portrait on his desk, looking at it daily. Every time he saw something new, Joseph's protective presence, Ruth's determined gaze despite fear, the children's serious faces representing hope. The photograph reminded him why historical research mattered, why looking closely at the past was essential. One afternoon, a graduate student knocked with a box of photographs from a South Carolina archive. "After reading your work, I thought I should examine these more carefully," she said. Marcus smiled, picking up his magnifying glass. "Let's look together." Because Ruth Freeman's message had been received. Her quiet resistance in that Montgomery studio had opened eyes nationwide to truths hidden for over a century. Every photograph deserved a second look. Every story deserved telling. Every scar, every mark, every subtle detail might be evidence of courage, survival. People fighting for freedom when freedom was denied. Their story was no longer hidden. Their courage no longer forgotten. Their legacy lived on.